Hey, Solar Mavericks. This is Benoit Tangent, host of the Solar Maverick podcast and CEO of Renew Energy. I'm excited to invite you to our winter solstice fundraiser. It's happening on Thursday, December 4th from 6 to 10 p.m. at Hudson Hall in Jersey City, New Jersey. It's going to be an incredible night, great food, amazing people from the clean energy community, and an inspiring cause. We'll be raising funds for Let's Share the Sun Foundation, which brings solar power to families with medical needs where they need 24-hour access to electricity. Primarily, they're working in Puerto Rico. Early bird pricing for this event is $50, with full ticket pricing being $60. Space is limited, so grab your ticket today. We'll have a link to it in the show notes to RSVP. Thank you, and let's get into it.
I don't think you're putting the genie back in the bottle, or the toothpaste back in the tube, if you will, when it comes to renewables. The cost curve is the cost curve. And so while budget bill will inevitably, I think, slow the progress and sort of slow adoption, it's not going to stop it. It's just going to slow it. At the end of the day, solar and wind produce cheap electrons, and the world needs more and more cheap electrons.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoit Tangent, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoit Tangent, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm really excited to have Nick Kerwin. He's the Senior Vice President at Versiris, and I'm excited to have Nick on the podcast. We've actually known each other a long time, Nick. We actually spoke when you worked at Wonder, and that was back 2017 to 2020, and have a lot of different experiences since then. Nick, I appreciate you making time to be on the Solar Maverick podcast. It's July 1st. Actually, it's interesting because the Senate just finalized the big, beautiful bill. I know Nick's been reading that. We kind of wanted to date the podcast just because everything's in flux. So, Nick, welcome to the podcast. I really appreciate you making time. I know it's like a crazy time for the industry with the big, beautiful bill. So,
yeah, thanks for having me. I was telling my wife that yesterday was the closest that I ever followed a piece of legislation in my life. I felt like I was watching the news ticker decide, 45 minutes at a time to do deep work. Someone just kept blowing up with news updates. So it's nice to be, sitting here, having a conversation with you, talking about the bigger picture.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's about 988 pages, so it's pretty dense material. And if our listeners are not familiar, can you talk about like Versiris Energy and how New Energy Equity is an owner of it, and then how it all kind of started from like a branding perspective? I think, that would be really helpful to our listeners who we call Mavericks. Yeah.
Right. So Versiris Energy, we spun out our C&I division from New Energy Equity last year. So company and division been around a long time, but last year, after a series of conversations, we made the decision that we were going to spin out a dedicated company and a dedicated brand focused solely on rooftop, solar, C&I solar. So Versiris Energy is a wholly owned subsidiary of New Energy Equity. So I actually report to the CEO, Josh Kunkel of New Energy Equity. But last year we decided, let's spin this out because really sort of from a branding perspective, it creates an opportunity for us as Versiris to focus on large corporate clients because that's where we want to do most of our work. And it allows New Energy Equity to focus on community solar, which is what they do particularly well. And so we split that up and have been doing that focus ever since. But we also continue to have that great intercompany relationship with New Energy Equity, continue to get that balance sheet behind us, those marketing resources, those legal resources. So there's a real symbiotic relationship between the companies as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great way to explain it. And then it's like behind the meter, primarily you were saying. Can you talk about like the solar and CNI market and maybe some of the markets that Versiris is focusing on? I'm assuming that you guys are specifically owning projects and partnering with developers and getting involved earlier stage.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a both and in terms of our go-to-market strategy. So I think one of the things that makes Versiris Energy unique is our go-to-market strategy because we are really focused on working with large clients who have an opportunity to do the repeat business, which is pretty unique in terms of how the last 20 years of C&I solar has been done. It's been primarily like, spend a ton of time, energy, and effort to stand up a 1 megawatt project, a 2 megawatt project, and then rinse and repeat and do it all over again. And through a series of, really good relationships with, some large corporates, we realized, hey, there's actually an incredible opportunity to work with large corporates who own a ton of real estate across the country, and you develop projects across multiple markets, bring our policy expertise, our engineering and design expertise across different utilities and different regulatory environments to play to their benefit and allow them to build more solar and deploy faster, which I think in light of the big budget bill, all of a sudden is looking like, really smart, the corporates who, went to market earlier. In terms of market dynamics, I think that there's a couple of things to call out. One, it's, the 20 plus market, 20 or so states, right, where solar largely makes sense.
Yeah.
And we're actively looking at projects in all those states for clients in all those states. But the other really interesting thing that's emerged over the last 18 to 24 months has been all of a sudden, for the first time in my 15-year career, the price of energy is getting expensive enough that, places like, Louisiana and Missouri and Kentucky are all of a sudden becoming like places that are interesting and potentially hitting, IRRs or ROIs, depending on the investment thresholds companies are making decisions on. And they're starting to pencil, which is like a very unique, it's an inflection point that it's just, I knew it was going to come at some point. And yet it's such a wow, okay, we're here. Now we're facing some headwinds. Those represented some incredible tailwinds. Where it's like, I knew this inflection point. With electrification and with AI, energy is not getting cheaper. And then in terms of structure, a lot of what we are doing is PPAs. So we're actually, New Energy Equity is actually owned by Elite, which is a Fortune 1000 company. So we do have this multi-billion-dollar balance sheet that stands behind us. And so we do have the in-house financing, which is fantastic. But a lot of our corporate buyers also want to take advantage of those tax credits, these soon to be expiring tax credits. They'll just do purchases. And so that's actually then a unique thing as well.
Interesting.
Going from spending the last 10 years of my career focusing primarily on third-party ownership structures to now, developing projects specifically for, large corporates or much market clients to just own outright. And so it's been a both and. That's why, I was trying to pair those two together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So is Vercyrus the EPC? Or are you subcontracting that, or do you do the E and the P and then subcontract the C, or how does that?
It's the latter. We have in-house engineering and design. We do a lot of the procurement ourselves, and then we will subcontract the construction and maybe some of the, the BOS kind of procurement. So, but that also allows us to be more nimble across markets.
Yeah, because, each sort of corporate might have different sort of facilities or offices in different states, and it's hard to have that infrastructure across a national footprint.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. Like there's certain clients who might only own property in one state. And, I'll be candid, we might not be the best fit, that whoever the best EPC is in that state might be the best.
Sure.
But I do think sort of what sets us apart is our ability to work across utilities, across states, and apply that national level expertise, and then project manage a ton of projects simultaneously. A lot of local EPCs struggle to do. They tend to do things a lot sequentially. So there's give and take, let's say.
That's a good way of saying it, Nick. And then also, too, New Energy Equity has a lot of experience owning assets. So I think you offer a different perspective as a builder of those projects on behalf of your corporate clients. And then, too, if you do a PPA and own the project as well, I think, I feel like sometimes you have EPCs who are just trying to build for the highest margin, and that might impact production estimates.
I haven't thought of it that way, but I do think it's a good way to think about it, because we do very much develop all projects, whether they're purchased in-house, as if we're the owner, right? We're constantly de-risking projects. We're constantly looking for ways to, boost production. We're always thinking about O&M. One of the conversations we have with our design team is we need to be thinking about O&M during the initial design phase, right? Like it's an A to Z exercise, and let's not start thinking about O&M when we get to the middle, but O&M at the outset, so that if we do end up owning these assets long-term, right, they're going to be good, profitable, de-risked assets. And if a client ends up owning them, Well, great. That's just going to further our credibility with them. Those assets,
Definitely.
perform or overperform. Yeah, it's cool that you called that out because I actually hadn't made that distinction myself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a unique perspective, I feel like, that new competitive advantage that you have compared to other.
I hope so.
And then I was going to say too, like, I think it's smart to build the relationships with the corporates because, as you know, like, it takes so much time to build that relationship and the trust. And instead of just doing like one or two projects with a small corporate, here's an opportunity where you're doing a national footprint. And usually, if you do a great job for the first one, it's a lot easier. Just always the first deal is always the hardest, but it's a lot easier to do.
It's fundamentally true. We internally talk about return on time, right? And so the large opportunity, the idea being that you can dedicate that many more hours, right? So if you have a one-off 1 megawatt, that might be worth 100 hours of development. But if like it's hey, we might be able to do 100 megawatts over the next decade, that's probably 1,000 hours, a whole paradigm in between that to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And the relationship then is scalable, as you mentioned, the return on time, which is
100%.
huge.
Like particularly the largest corporate clients now own their own real estate, right? So they're not a great, those represent different challenges when you bring in, third party real estate owners
Sure.
that sometimes can be overcome, but sometimes can't. The ones that do own their real estate, like more and more, you're just seeing them realizing, hey, these are really good investments. And by the way, Microsoft and Amazon and Walmart and Target and Cargill and all these other major corporates are already doing it and reaping the rewards. And Wall Street is rewarding them for those decisions, right? The positive IRRs that they're seeing. So all of a sudden they've it's almost like the red carpet has been rolled out, and there's sort of the early adopter risk. It's kind of like, okay, the train might be leaving the station soon. Like, let's hop on.
Yeah, definitely. That is so true. That's a great point. You know, what I was thinking is just really interesting because real estate asset owners, by the way, I know this because we've spoken to a lot of real estate owners, and it's like almost another line of business. Instead of looking at just leasing the property, here's another revenue source, especially if they own the facility, and then they could charge their tenants and then marketing.
And refining. Like for all the ones constantly like refinancing, right now is not a great time
For sure.
to answer commercial real estate, but rates improve. Now all of a sudden they have, they've made material improvements and increased the valuation of their buildings that much more, right? And they're able to get more equity out to put back into the business. Yeah, that's a slightly different piece of the CNI segment, but I've also given that one a lot of thought as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a new and exciting, but not so new, going back to basics. Is the PA structure still effectively the same, or are you seeing any unique structures, or is that time period 15 to 20 years, which is the normal solar?
I think you're seeing a lot of 20 to 25-year PPAs. That continues to be the most common way to go to market. A couple markets, you're also seeing the integration of storage into the PPAs, right? And availability guarantees. So that I think is where some of the financial innovation is happening, because I think as often happens with technology, right? Like we've been talking about batteries for years.
Yes.
Yet it's only, particularly at the DG level, only really the last couple of years where we're really pricing them out and looking at deployment strategies in earnest. I know utility scale is a couple of years ahead of us on that front, but the point I was getting at was that now the financing is also finally catching up, right? Like the technology is usually 1 or 2 years in front of the banks. So I also think that's like one of the curves that we're bending is the financing and just getting more and more comfortable with what works from a storage standpoint. And right now, there's only a few markets that in the DG space, actually work if you don't need some sort of critical backup, dollars and cents standpoint. But that's going to continue to change, right? As the cost and storage has a huge carve out in that budget bill. So pending big changes for all the listeners months from now, storage is likely going to continue to play a bigger and bigger role.
Yeah, that's so true. If our listeners are not familiar, there's a standalone investment tax credit for storage at 30%. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, I think it goes out at 30% till 2033, I think, or
2032 or 2033. Yeah. Looking a lot closer. Admittedly, this morning I was looking a lot closer at the solar language.
Yeah, I guess they removed the excise tax.
Thank God.
Right.
So again, hopefully that stays the same.
And that will cause onshoring. Hopefully, we'll have a lot more solar, which we do already have, starting to have a lot of assembly of panels, but then also, sorry, not EV, storage manufacturing in the US, which right now it's predominant in China.
We haven't even talked about the challenge of tariffs, but like that all ties.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's the other one.
It's like those two things intersect like in a crazy way. Before the budget bill was dominating a lot of my thinking time. The previous couple months was spent thinking about the impacts of tariffs and making sure that we're shoring up our supply chain and we're making the right decision about what we are. Again, this goes back to the design, right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, what products are we designing with? And what degree of confidence do we have that we're going to be able to, get those at right competitive prices? And so that all those conversations are still very much underway as some of the tariff conversations unfold. But yet, looking at domestic manufacturing continues to be a very key part of that, right? And then now,
definitely.
I get back to the whole foreign entity of concern, which, again, to be honest, is a phrase that I had not heard, prior to May 22nd. Like, I don't know, you got.
Not really. I mean, it wasn't something we really talked about, right? Because technically the foreign or fiat, right, it's China, right? And China, not the other like Iran or North Korea. We have to really.
Iran's not manufacturing a lot of inverters, It's like we don't have to blend the same way. But right, when 90% of the global supply chain is coming out of China, all of a sudden you have to think about things in a very significant way. And yeah, I felt like I was going back to economics 101. All of a sudden we're trying to game out like the macroeconomic implications of, what will inevitably be a run on supply.
Of course.
Right?
That's the first thing that's happening, right? Everyone's trying to get as much supply as possible.
So, we should be so lucky to live in such interesting times.
Definitely. I think it's hard, right? Because businesses like certainty. And I think it's been really challenging with the tariffs because it seems to be changing all the time. And then we all were excited about the Inflation Reduction Act. Then it took 2 years or 2.5 years to clearly get language. Then the new administration comes in and is basically trying to repeal, change to lower incentives. Yeah, effectively a repeal. They're not really saying that. But it's challenging, right? Because it's like these things take a lot of time to do, months or years in the making, and then some bureaucrat who's never worked. Sorry, I should be say it in a nicer way.
It's also so frustrating, right? Like just on the IRA piece, right, in terms of implementation, like we had just gotten to the point earlier this year. We're like, hey, we're gonna do our, first domestic content project this year. Secured supply. Right. It was meeting the new, IRS 45% threshold. We had documentation, we had letters from manufacturers, right? Like we were, set up to do that. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff with the tariffs and, and then the budget bill happens and it just talk about throwing uncertainty. Like we're just sitting here like, kind of waiting, like, right? Are the goalposts going to shift? Are they not going to shift? Right? Can we not? And so I still very much hope we can. For the record.
Yeah.
I think over the next like 2 weeks, we'll probably have a better sense of where we land on that one. To the point about uncertainty, everyone in the solar industry has been around for more than 3 years, right? We always joke about riding the solar coaster, right?
Yeah.
It's any RE plus event you go to, there's some wise crap about, riding the solar coaster. And I've been riding the solar coaster for 15 years. And I'm thinking back and it's probably been like 2011 was maybe the last time I felt this much uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right. And I was in a much more junior role at that point, as you can imagine. Right. Like I had bosses who were worried about the big stuff.
Yeah.
And so, when I'm talking to my team, I am trying to say like, we've been through a lot. And also, I don't think as much as from a macro perspective, I don't think you're putting the genie back in the bottle, right? Like, or the toothpaste back in the tube, if you will, when it comes to renewables. The cost curve just is the cost curve, right? Like setting aside, the hottest summer of our life, right? We, just setting that aside, like the cost curve is the cost curve. And so while budget bill will inevitably, I think, slow the progress and sort of slow adoption, it's not going to stop it. It's just going to slow it, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, solar and wind produce cheap electrons, and the world needs more and more cheap electrons, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole summary of it, right? The long-term prognosis for solar is great. Solar is a technology, not a fuel. It's the cheapest form of electricity in the US, and it's the fastest form. And as you mentioned, like load growth is going to increase exponentially with, AI and data centers. And what this is all going to lead to is actually, unfortunately, is like electricity prices are going to go up. And for what you do, it's actually a good thing. There's actually some
Right. It
benefits
helps
to
our segment of the market. Yeah. The macro is probably negative. It does
but
help.
it helps behind the meter.
Well, and right, like one of the interesting things working in Rooftop is, we can develop a project, have all the contracts signed, and be producing electricity in under a year. That's the
Yeah.
only energy generation technology that you can do that. Now, that's not everywhere in the country, to be clear. Permitting reform is something that, I think regardless of politics, we can generally get behind.
But I think that's a challenge too, because part of the big, beautiful bill was the whole debate about in service versus start of construction. And there's a lot of things, as you know, as being in the industry a long time, there's so many things you can control: permitting, interconnection, incentives, all the things like supply chain. I mean, all these things are creating like complexities. When you add tariff, when you're requiring that you can't get certain products from certain countries, it just creates all this sort of unnecessary complexity
And uncertainty, right?
and uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a genuine challenge. Thankfully, we have a lot of really smart people working on the problem.
The solar industry is
All
very
of those listeners, today, all right, included amongst them.
I was going to say, like, you mentioned the time that we've been fortunate in the US where load growth has stayed very stable or grown gradually, and electricity prices have stayed pretty constant and not high increases. But now, because of the load growth of AI and technology, and then because of the government adapting the incentives for renewables, you're going to see higher electricity price increases. And is there any of that being factored into the PPA, like in the inflation factors or?
No, it's a great call out. And right, when we go to investment committees, right, we have sort of very wonky versions of these discussions, right? You talk about, load growth and, long-term default risk and, things of that.
Sure.
But it ties back to this question fundamentally, which is the client saving money and will they be saving money in the future? And again, having done this for 15 years, right? Like the first decade of my career, it was almost like we would never model utility rates. Maybe we push it at 4% a year, right?
Yes.
Like in sort of an extreme case, right? But it was usually 2.5%, 3% a year that we were modeling, kind of like pegged to inflation. And you look back 30 years and like that was normal. And then over the last 5, 6, 7 years, you start looking at, utility rate jumps around the country and seeing double-digit increases is becoming more the norm and expectation, right? 10, 12, 17% jumps.
Yeah.
You start compounding that over time. Like you only need to do that like 2 or 3 times before like, your $100 electricity bill just became $200 in like 5 years and you're using the exact same amount of energy, right? Like,
Yes.
so like the long story short is it's making it easier. It's also enabling us to like look at, scenarios where we can tolerate higher annual escalators, which results in lower year one pricing, which further increases our flexibility to look at, saving customers money out of the gate. So those are some of the macro trends that I think are cutting our way right now, which is good.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I appreciate you explaining that. You want the customer to be saving day one, right? Because it's like challenging to sell that to them, right? That you're hedging against long-term electricity, and if they're not saving day one, I feel like it's harder internally to sell.
Yeah, you talk about like at the investment committees, like strategic default risk, right? The idea that, the company isn't saving money and 3, 4, or 5 years from now, they're like, hey, we're not saving money. Like we're just going to break this PPA.
Yeah.
Okay? It's just really hard to walk away from a situation where if we break the PPA, we're actually going to end up spending more money, right? Which is why, for years I've been saying this is one of the like safest investments, right, that you could make as a bank or a tax equity partner or even
Oh, yeah.
private equity investor.
Yeah, no, definitely. I totally agree with you. I'm so familiar with this. It's that it's really interesting what you're doing. I was going to say you talked about storage before, and in certain markets it makes sense. You mentioned about battery backup, but then it sounded like you're maybe doing storage also not just for battery backup, for like ancillary services and other uses of the battery. Can you talk about that?
I mean, primarily we're looking at it in the markets where it does make sense, right?
Yeah,
California, net metering 3.0, Hawaii, sort of just a traditional
yeah,
ish. Massachusetts, where it's mandated for large systems, right?
you're talking about the smart program.
Our program, yeah, exactly. The five boroughs, again, where like there's
Older.
real arbitrage, like opportunities. Yeah, those are the markets right now where you can look at storage in a way like that will typically pencil out. Right now,
Sure.
the use case is different, so I don't want to overgeneralize. And outside of those markets, it's pretty hard to make it pencil out if you're not applying some level of backup security or these like really interesting use cases, right? Where, you're off grid, you're a mine and you're off grid, and having battery backup allows you to keep the mine open for 4 hours longer in the evening.
For sure.
So there are those sort of very kind of edge case that do make sense, but then you get into some like very bespoke project dynamics are very cool at the same time, typically not repeatable, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's not scalable. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then with rooftop solar, are you seeing like innovations related to like racking or panels or equipment, cleaning or
Yeah, I think the cleaning, yes, particularly in areas where cleaning is like Central Valley, right? Arizona.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah, like dustier places, right?
that's your
Us getting a ton. So you're seeing some innovations there. You're continuing to see just oscillation on the inverter front in terms of using solar edge versus just right doing string inverters on the roof, right, for rapid shutdown compliance. So when rapid shutdown passed, I think it was like 11 years ago initially when I was written into the fire code. I remember thinking like, oh wow, this is like a huge deal. And I never thought that like 11 years later, I'd still be talking about it like on a regular basis. And some of the innovation that needs to continue to happen there is to continue to look at honestly fire code and ways that can be done
very
to ensure safety. Or because the last thing anybody wants is a thermal event or a fire.
so sure.
Right? Like that's sort of the worst case scenario. So I think the industry writ large has every incentive to get that right. But at the same time, we need to do it in a way where we can keep deploying at pace.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a great point.
And then, yeah, outside of that, some like very modest, like wire management changes, like relatively stable. Like, I think one of the interesting things like we're navigating right now is just the panels themselves. You're seeing a lot of module manufacturers move to a, continually larger panel that makes more and more sense on ground mount single axis trackers. But you get to a point where of the physical size of those panels, and they no longer make sense to put on a rooftop, right?
Yes, that makes
So it's
sense.
like, hey, this thing's unruly, right? Out in the field in a pasture, it makes all the sense in the world. I don't think that's an innovation as much as it is like sort of an emerging trend line
Yeah.
in terms of, almost having like two kind of panels. Is this going to be a rooftop panel or is this going to be, ground panel?
No, that's a great point too. And are you seeing like this is common with the single axis trackers for ground mounted, but are you seeing like trackers for rooftop solar or
We're not, no. For a long time, I remember the innovation a few years ago, right, was to have east-west racking and sort of increase the density. But again, I think there's been sort of the pendulum is swinging back, right? Because we're thinking about O&M.
Oh, that's right.
You know what I mean? Like, so it's like, oh yeah, initial design perspective, this looks great. And then this is a much more difficult system to O&M in terms of like how it's laid out and accessing panels, troubleshooting, right? And so then you start factoring in sort of the headache that comes along with that. Also the cost, right? Like O&M companies are going to charge you more because they're like, this is kind of one of these PETA projects. And so we don't love these. So yeah, we'll do it, but we'll do it at a 40% premium,
Yeah.
So I actually think that's an area like where the innovation has sort of come back to what we were doing 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, that is really interesting. I never even thought about that. That's a
Um,
great point.
yeah, I think that's probably one of the innovations, at least on our end. And I do think this is more industry wide, but is the trend line of thinking about O&M and life cycle dynamics from the outset. I think we were at this point in the solar industry and the maturation, right? It wasn't the nascent years, right? But it was sort of like the
Sure.
adolescent years where it felt a little Wild West
Yeah.
years there. And, there was a lot of EPCs kind of running fast and loose with things.
Sure.
That ended up with thermal events or poor wire management or, O&M nightmares. And now you're seeing again, like corporate clients coming out and publishing their own tech specs and saying, right, these are the standards we expect, operate at. Thankfully for us, like, our tech spec is even more rigid. Right? But again, it's because we're thinking about things long term. We're thinking about things as owners, right?
Sure.
Trying to build long term relationships. So it is just sort of a fundamentally different approach to the market. Because again, we're trying to build a business that's going to be around for a long time, right? This isn't about optimizing quarterly returns. This is about building a business that has some real staying power. So yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining. And Nick, you've talked about a lot of trends. Is there any trend that you would like to speak about that you haven't talked about?
No.
Just wanted to make sure.
I've gone into it.
Yeah, and then you're a maverick in yourself, like you've been in the industry now for 15 years. It seems like all your experience really has been in energy and specifically like solar energy. Can you talk to our audience about your solar journey?
Sure. Yeah. So, I guess my solar journey technically starts in college in undergrad. I took a environment sustainability class, which was essentially like sustainability 101, but it wasn't called that. And it was with this great professor who kind of just like lit a fire under me. And simultaneously, I had this other professor who was just like really kind of pushing me to think big and have big, hairy, audacious goals. And I said, I want to get into the renewable energy industry. And I didn't know what that looked like at the time. Right. Well, fast forward a few years later, I got a master's and, there's Great Recession happened and all that. And, I'm in New Mexico, which is where I'm originally from. And I got a buddy who had just gotten a job as a residential solar salesman for this new company that had just started. And so I went out to coffee with him and I was peppering him with questions. I was like, oh, this sounds so cool, man. I'm like, this sounds awesome. And he's like, you got to meet my boss. Like, you got to meet my boss. You got to meet Ryan. And there was this solar fair. Something like this wouldn't even exist anymore, right? Like, this is 2010 when the US solar industry did 550 megawatts of capacity.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was 60x that. Capacity, right? Panels were over $4 a watt at this point, right? And I love talking to folks who have been around for even 20 or 25 years. And they're like, oh, that's nothing. Panel used to be $10 a watt, right?
Yeah, seriously.
Which are always fun times. But yeah, so I've ended up going to this small solar conference, which was just like, people making, solar ovens, right? There were like two residential solar companies. I meet this guy, Ryan, and my buddy Nate had told him about me. And I dressed up, kind of dressed to impress. I just talked my way into a job. I just, met him and I was like, I think I'd be a great solar salesman for you. You should.
Yeah.
He's like, well, do you have any sales experience? I was like, no. Like, but rest, I'm going to do great for you.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I said or what he latched onto. Maybe it was just like my moxie and my confidence of like,
Sure.
a 20 something Nick. But yeah, he ended up giving me the job and, ended up spending, years in residential, did some, management there, moved over to the commercial side before then joining Wonder Capital, right, in 2017. That's where I really sharpened my finance chops, sharpened my, startup chops. And then, yeah, I've been working really in the DG space since then, right? Where large national companies are focusing on different markets. Joined New Energy Equity a little over 4 years ago as the director of project acquisitions. Then a couple years ago, this opportunity came across to, lead the CI event. So I stepped into that along with my vice president of operations, Rocky Shoemaker. And that's really where kind of everything culminated to spin off for Cyrus. That's the short version. We can have drinks sometime and I can tell you the long version.
Maybe at the next happy hour, since
Yeah.
we hung out in San Diego at the O&M Solar Asset Management O&M conference at the WRIS.
That sounds fantastic. I look forward to it.
Yeah, but it's actually a great description of your background. It's interesting how you came into the opportunity of solar and then your progression from residential, then into financing, right? And then into commercial, industrial, and then how things have changed from 550 megawatts to 60 times that. And then you've seen a lot of the ups and downs. I mean, I started in solar in 2010 as well. So, a lot of what you talked
Riding roller coaster together, than I.
on the front row of the roller coasters. Yeah, hands in there. And it's interesting because I feel like the solar industry needs so many people going forward because it's going to continue to grow exponentially. This is just the beginning. It's funny. I think we don't see it maybe because we've been in it too long as that it's just beginning actually, but it is only beginning.
I agree with that. But I also think if we take that step back, particularly if you look at it on a global level, like we are on the part of the hockey curve that just got real steep and is going straight up. Right. We just crossed that inflection point, right? Where it's like slow, it's slow, it's slow, then it's happening all at once.
Oh yeah.
Right. So we're facing this, budget bill that is creating a lot of turmoil, and we're navigating a ton of choppy waters in terms of all the uncertainty. But yeah, as we pull back, this might slow us down, but not going to prevent where we're eventually going here.
Yeah, it's exciting times. I mean, I think I just want it to be finalized as quickly as possible so that we can all plan how we get around it, and strategize, be strategic.
I would absolutely love some certainty.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all wanting. And it's unfortunate because it's been extremely challenging to plan and to do long-term sort of thinking, as you mentioned. Once you figured it out, then everything's just changing, And it's not just on the federal level, it's also on the state level. High interest rates, at least historically, that's created challenges. The tariffs, tariffs have been started during the Trump administration to the President Biden's administration, now this administration. So
the good news is if we can navigate all of the uncertainty you just laid out, then we can pretty much navigate anything.
Oh, it's amazing if you think about it, like the renewable energy and specifically the solar industry, what is the constant adaptation? So that's a great point.
That's going to be the companies that do well, right? The companies first are nimble and ready to adapt, and the companies that really struggle through this are the ones that are going to be kind of stuck in old paradigms and not setting themselves up to be flexible. So for all words out there, again, stay flexible, stay nimble, right? We're going to navigate these waters.
And then also too, even AI, right? The companies that incorporate AI the quickest will have the biggest competitive advantage. And as you, Nick, we've already lost some companies along the way, SunPower, the other resident, Mosaic, right?
Yeah, that was more 2 months ago. Yeah.
Well, this has been an amazing interview. I really appreciate your time, Nick, and bringing a lot of great perspectives and experience. If our audience wanted to learn more about you or the company, what's the best way for them to do that?
Visit our website, VersailesEnergy.com. Follow us on LinkedIn. We have a Versailles Energy page. Follow me on LinkedIn, Nick Kerwin. I'm happy to connect. Yeah, and really appreciate the time, Benoit.
Anytime. This was a great interview. I'm glad that we were able to get this, and I think it's exciting times, and you're in a part of the sector. It's going to advantageous some of these things that are happening. So great. Well, thank you again. I appreciate your time there.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Renew Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@renewenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoit Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.